Part 5. Devastation of the country of the Eburones, 53 BC. 29. Learning from the scouts of the Ubii that the Suebi had retired into the forests, Caesar was afraid that if he followed them he might run short of corn, since, as already said, none of the Germans pay much attention to agriculture. He therefore decided to advance no farther. However, so as not to let the natives think they had seen the last of him, he left the greater part of the bridge standing. In order to hold up any reinforcements which they might try to send to Gaul, after withdrawing his army, he broke down the end that touched the Ubian bank for a distance of 200 feet, and at the Gallic end erected a 4-story tower, posted a detachment of 12 cohorts to protect the bridge, and fortified the position with strong defense works. A young officer named Gaius Volcasius Tullus was placed in command of it. When the crops were beginning to ripen, Caesar set out through the Ardennes to fight Ambiorix. He sent Lucius Minucius Basileus in advance with all the cavalry to see if he could gain any advantage by travelling quickly and striking at a favourable opportunity. Caesar told him to forbid fires to be lighted in his camps so as not to give the enemy warning of his approach from a distance, and promised to follow him immediately. 30. Basileus duly carried out his instructions. Completing the journey more quickly than anyone had thought possible, he surprised a number of Eburones working in the fields, and following their directions hurried on to a place where Ambiorix, guarded only by a few horsemen, was said to be. Much depends on fortune, in war as in all other things. It was a lucky chance that enabled Basileus to catch Ambiorix unprepared and off his guard, and to appear on the scene before his approach was reported or even rumoured. But by an even greater stroke of luck, Ambiorix escaped alive, although he lost all the military equipment that he had with him, his carriages and his horses. His house was in a wood, like most Gallic houses, for they generally choose sites near woods and rivers to avoid the heat. So, fighting in a confined space, his attendants and friends were able to resist the attack of Basileus's cavalry for a time. Meanwhile, one of them mounted him on a horse, and his flight was covered by the wood. In this way, he was first brought into danger and then delivered from it by the all-prevailing power of fortune. 31. Ambiorix did not assemble his troops, either on purpose, because he thought it better not to give battle, or through lack of time, because his plans were upset by the sudden arrival of Roman cavalry, which he assumed would be followed up by the rest of the army. At all events, he sent out messengers through the countryside, bidding every man shift for himself. Some fled into the Ardennes, others into a continuous belt of marshes, while those who lived nearest the sea hid in places cut off from the mainland at high tide. Many left their own country and entrusted their lives and all their possessions to complete strangers. Catuvolcus, who as king of one half of the Eburones had joined in Ambiorix's enterprise, was now a weak old man, unable to face the hardships of war or flight. Solemnly cursing Ambiorix for having suggested the plan, he poisoned himself with yew, a tree which is very common in Gaul and Germany. 32. The Segni and Condrusi, people of Germanic origin and generally counted as Germans, living between the Eburones and the Treueri, sent ambassadors to ask Caesar not to regard them as enemies, and not to assume that all Germans in Gaul were leagued against him. They said that they had never thought of making war upon him, and had not sent any help to Ambiorix. After confirming their statements by interrogating prisoners, Caesar ordered them to bring to him any Eburonian fugitives who had come to their country. If they obeyed, he would respect their territory. He then separated his forces into 3 divisions and took all the heavy baggage to Atuatuca, a fortress situated about in the middle of the country of the Eburones, where Sabinus and Cotta had had their winter quarters. He had several reasons for selecting this place. The principal one was that the fortifications constructed the previous year were still intact, which would save the soldiers the labour of building new ones. He left the baggage under the protection of the 14th Legion, one of the three which he had recently brought from Italy, where they had been levied. He placed this legion and the camp in charge of Cicero, assigning him also 200 cavalry. 33. After dividing the army, Caesar ordered Labienus to advance with 3 legions towards the coast into the region bordering on the country of the Menapii, and sent Trebonius with 3 more to ravage the district lying on the frontiers of the Atuatucae. He took the remaining 3 himself and decided to march to the river Scheldt, which flows into the Meuse, and to the western end of the Ardennes, where he heard Ambiorix had gone with a small number of cavalry. Before setting out, he promised to return in a week, when a distribution of rations to the legion left at the fortress would be due. He asked Labienus and Trebonius to return by the same date if the military situation allowed, so that after holding a further discussion, they might be able to restart the campaign on new lines in light of what they would have learned by that time of the enemy's plans. 34. It has been explained that the Eburones had no regular force assembled, no stronghold, and no garrison capable of armed resistance. Their population was scattered in all directions. Each man had installed himself in any remote glen, any wooded spot, or impenetrable morass that offered a chance of protection or escape. These hiding places were known to the natives living in the neighborhood, and great care was needed to ensure the safety of the Roman troops. So long as they kept together, they were in no danger from a panic-stricken and scattered enemy, but losses severe enough to weaken the army might easily be sustained by the waylaying of individual soldiers who were tempted far afield by the hope of plunder, or got separated from the rest because the ill-defined and half-concealed paths through the woods were not practicable for columns in close formation. The only way to make an end of the business and exterminate this race of criminals would have been to break up the army into a large number of detachments which could be sent out separately, but it was safer to keep the companies in their regular formation, according to the established practice of the Roman army, although this meant that they could not injure the Gauls in such country. Even so, any men who strayed apart from the main body were liable to be ambushed and surrounded by some of the bolder spirits among them. In these difficult circumstances, the most careful precautions were taken. Caesar thought it better to let the enemy off comparatively lightly, in spite of the men's burning desire for revenge, than to punish them severely at the cost of serious loss to his own troops. He preferred to expose Gauls instead of Roman legionaries to the dangers of fighting in the forests, and also wanted to envelop the Eburones with a great multitude of men in order to punish their heinous crime with total annihilation. Large numbers soon assembled from every side. 35. While the whole of the Eburonian territory was being plundered, it was getting near the day on which Caesar had intended to return to the legion left in charge of the baggage. At this moment an instance occurred of the important part played in war by accident, which can have far-reaching consequences. After the panic-stricken flight of the enemy already described, there was no hostile force in the field to give the slightest occasion for alarm. But the Germans across the Rhine heard that the Eburones were being plundered, and that all comers were invited to share the spoil. Immediately a force of 2,000 cavalry was raised by the Sugambri, who lived close to the Rhine, the people who, as said above, sheltered the fugitive Tencteri and Usipetes. They crossed the river on boats and rafts, some 30 miles below the place where Caesar's bridge had been built and the garrison left, entered the territory of the Eburones, caught a number of the scattered fugitives, and seized a quantity of cattle, a prize much sought after by the barbarians. Lured on by the hope of more plunder, they advanced farther, for these born fighters and bandits were not to be stopped by marshes or forests. On asking their prisoners where Caesar was, they were told that he had started on a campaign some distance away, and that all the army had left the district. One of the prisoners added, "Why go after this paltry, miserable loot, when you have the chance of making your fortunes right away? In 3 hours you can reach Atuatuca, where the Romans have stored all their property. The garrison is so small that they can't even man the wall, and not a man dare set foot outside the entrenchments. The offer of such a chance decided the Germans. They hid the booty they had got, and guided by their informant made straight for Atuatuca. 36. Throughout the previous week, Cicero had been most careful to keep the soldiers in camp according to Caesar's instructions, not allowing even a single servant to go outside the entrenchment. But on the 7th day he began to fear that Caesar would not keep his appointment. It was said that he had advanced a long way and there was no news of his return. The soldiers too were grumbling at Cicero's patient acceptance of the situation. To be cooped up like this in camp, they said, was almost as bad as a blockade. With 9 legions and a strong cavalry force in the field, and the enemy scattered and very nearly destroyed, he had no reason to expect a serious accident within 3 miles of his camp. Accordingly, he sent 5 cohorts to get corn from the nearest fields, which were separated from the camp by only a single hill. A number of sick men had been left behind by the legions. From these there went with the cohorts, as a separate detachment, some 300 men who had recovered from illness during the week, and permission to accompany them was granted also to a large number of servants, who took out a great many of the animals that were being kept in the camp. 37. It happened that just at this moment the German cavalry appeared and, riding right on without slackening speed, tried to break in by the back gate. As the view was obstructed by woods on that side, they were not seen until they were quite close to the camp, so close that the traders who had their tents at the foot of the rampart had no time to get away. The suddenness of the attack upset the soldiers, and the cohort on guard had difficulty in withstanding the first rush. The enemy spread out all round, trying to find a way in. The soldiers had hard work to defend the gates. Elsewhere, the lie of the land and the entrenchments gave protection. The whole camp was in a state of alarm. The men were asking one another the cause of the disturbance, and could not tell where to assemble or in which direction to advance. Some said the camp was already taken. Others maintained that the Germans had come in triumph after destroying the Roman army and its commander-in-chief. Most of them were filled with strange superstitious fancies suggested by the spot on which they stood, and saw in imagination the disaster that had befallen Cotta and Sabinus, who perished not far from the same fort. Everyone was so paralyzed by fear that the Germans believed the prisoner had spoken the truth when he told them that there was no garrison in the camp. They strove hard to force their way in, calling on one another not to let such a piece of luck slip through their fingers. 38. Among the sick men left with the garrison was Baculus, who had served under Caesar as chief centurion of his legion, and has been mentioned in connection with earlier engagements. For 5 days he had been too ill to eat. Feeling anxious for his own and his comrades' safety, he walked unarmed out of his tent, and, on seeing the enemy close at hand and the situation extremely critical, borrowed arms from the nearest soldiers and posted himself in the gateway. He was joined by the centurions of the cohort on guard, and for a time they fought together to hold the enemy's attack. Baculus was severely wounded and fainted, and the others just managed to save him by passing him back from hand to hand. This respite gave the rest of the troops time to recover courage enough to man the fortifications and make a show of defence. 39. Meanwhile the reaping party, which had finished its work, heard the shouting at the camp. The horsemen hurried on, and discovered how serious the peril was. Out there in the open there was no fortification to shelter the frightened men. Raw recruits without any experience, and they turned to the military tribune and centurions, waiting to be told what to do. Even the bravest were unnerved by the emergency. The Germans caught sight of the standards in the distance and desisted from their attack on the camp. At first they thought it was the legions, returned from the distant expedition on which the prisoners said they had gone, but when they saw how small the force was, they regarded it with contempt and attacked from all sides. 40. The servants ran forward to the nearest rising ground, from which they were quickly dislodged, and, by rushing to the standards round which the companies were formed up, increased the nervous soldiers' alarm. Since the camp was so near, some were for adopting a wedge formation and making a quick dash through, feeling confident that, though a few might be surrounded and killed, the rest could escape. Others preferred to make a stand on the hill and all take their chance together. The latter plan was rejected by the detachment of veterans which had gone out with the cohorts. The veterans, therefore, with words of mutual encouragement, advanced under their commander Gaius Trebonius, a Roman knight, broke right through the enemy, and reached the camp without a single casualty. Close behind them, in the gap made by their courageous charge, the servants and the cavalry got safely through. But those who had taken their stand on the hill showed that they had still learnt nothing of the art of war. They failed either to stick to the plan they had chosen of defending themselves on the high ground, or to imitate the swift and vigorous action which they could see had saved their comrades. Instead, in an attempt to regain the camp, they let themselves be caught in a bad position on low-lying ground. The centurions, some of whom had been promoted for gallantry from lower grades in other legions to higher grades in this one, were determined not to forfeit the reputation they had won in previous actions, and fell fighting with the utmost courage. Some of the soldiers were saved by the centurions' brave stand, which made the enemy fall back, and, to their surprise, reached the camp in safety. The rest were surrounded by the enemy and killed. 41. As the Germans saw that the Roman troops had now manned the fortifications, they gave up hope of taking the camp by storm, and retired across the Rhine with the booty that they had hidden in the woods. Even after their departure, the defenders were still so frightened that Volusinus, who was sent ahead by Caesar with the cavalry and arrived that night in the camp, could not make them believe that Caesar was close at hand with his army safe and sound. Fear had so completely possessed them all that they nearly took leave of their senses, and would have it that the whole army had been cut to pieces, and that the cavalry had managed to escape by flight. If the army were not destroyed, they maintained, the Germans would never have attacked the camp. The panic was eventually stopped by Caesar's arrival. 42. He was well aware of the way things happen in war, and on his return made only one criticism, that the cohorts had been allowed to leave their post in the garrison. Cicero should have avoided running even the slightest risk. For the rest, he recognized that what had happened was largely the result of accident. It was a strange chance that had brought the enemy to the camp so suddenly, and a still stranger chance that had sent them away when they were almost masters of the rampart and gates. And the strangest thing of all was that, although their object in crossing the Rhine was to plunder Ambiorix's country, circumstances had led them to attack the Roman camp instead, and thus render Ambiorix the greatest service he could have desired. 43. Setting out once more to harass the Eburones, Caesar sent out in all directions a large force of cavalry that he had collected from the neighbouring tribes. Every village and every building they saw was set on fire. All over the country the cattle were either slaughtered or driven off as booty, and the crops, a part of which had already been laid flat by the autumnal rains, were consumed by the great numbers of horses and men. It seemed certain, therefore, that even if some of the inhabitants had escaped for the moment by hiding, they must die by starvation after the retirement of the troops. With such a large number of horsemen scouring the country in separate parties, it happened time and again that prisoners were taken who had just seen Ambiorix in flight. They would actually look round to see where he was, insisting that he was barely out of sight. This raised his pursuers' hopes of running him down, and so standing high in Caesar's favour. They took endless pains and made almost superhuman efforts, but they always seemed just to have missed what they so ardently desired. Ambiorix would escape by hiding in a wood or ravine, and under cover of night would make off in some new direction, escorted only by 4 horsemen, for to no one else did he dare entrust his life. 44. After ravaging the country in this way, Caesar withdrew his army, minus the 2 cohorts of Cicero's legion which had been lost, to Durocortorum, a town of the Remi, where he convened a Gallic council and held an inquiry into the conspiracy of the Senones and Carnutes. Acco, the instigator of the plot, was condemned to death and executed in the ancient Roman manner. Some others, who fled in fear of being brought to trial, were outlawed. Caesar then distributed the legions in winter quarters, 2 on the frontier of the Trereri, 2 among the Lingones, and the other 6 at Agedincum in the country of the Senones. And, after provisioning them, since Gaul was quiet, set out for northern Italy as usual to hold his assizes.